So welcome, Jim Bokern from the Manitowish Waters Historical Society. Here we are, the first two images on exploring Alder and Wild Rice Lakes. To the left, you have a 1937 image of aerial photos of Alder and Wild Rice Lake, and you can see it isn't very developed over in these regions. On the right, you have an 1896 map showing Rice Lake and Alder Lake and connections by Ojibwe trails to Ike Walton and Little Trout Lake. And that's where we're going to kind of begin this presentation. We're going to start way down here at the inlet of the Trout River into Wild Rice Lake, move through Wild Rice Lake, go up the Trout River, go around Alder. We'll take a little run up to Theisen and come back around like a balloon and end our journey. So come on with us as we move along our lakes. All righty, let's see if we can get our slides to advance. So one of the really cool things that about the history of Manitowish Waters is we have so many great maps from early on, more than many other communities. This 1847 map from the Owen expedition shows Monoman Lake right here, which means wild rice in Ojibwe, and Wadupikig, which is means alder, is the name of Alder Lake right here. So it's interesting that Manitowish, Alder, and Wild Rice all retain their names from Ojibwe roots. Rest Lake and the Rest Lake Dam was very much prized by early logging interests, and we get real insights to the water levels based on the research by the Army Corps of Engineers. From 1878, their reports give us incredible insights, and I would invite all of you to see these impacts at Kohler Library on the large map that is on the wall when you enter. The first proposed dam with the yellow arrow was right here on the outlet of what we call Vance Lake today. It was going to put a 25-foot head of water on the entire dam. But actually, by 1880, they reduced it to a 15-foot head of water. So the dam was built in the traditional area right here. And I need to let people in from the waiting room. Thank you. Okay. And as you look at all of this, you can see these large gradients that are at the base of the map at Kohler Library. It shows the bottom line of where the water was on Rest Lake, and then it shows every elevation as you go through the lakes. As we move to Alder Lake is Mud Lake 1, Alder Lake, and Mud Lake 2 was Wild Rice Lake. And this chart that's at the base of the map at Kohler Library shows actually the height of the river. Crooked River, look at it, the gradient here. That's Rice Creek, and of course, this is the Manitowish River right here. So if we look at the 1878 map, you can see where the water line would be in red if they put in that 25-foot dam. Right now, where I live right here on Alder Lake, I would be up to my neck in water. That would be for sure. But between Rest Lake and Manitowish Lake, there was a 3.5 rise. Those would be rapids between. But even between Manitowish and Alder, it jumped up not quite 2 feet, and then more than 2 feet between Alder and Wild Rice. So as we look at the early days and we think about these rivers and channels, we may think back to A.B. Gray's 1846 journey when he talked about picturesque lakes connected by streams barely sufficient for the width of a canoe. And then there was probably small rapids in between them. So we're going to be starting here, coming downriver into Wild Rice Lake on this tour. And as we enter Wild Rice Lake, we are immediately greeted by something that's pretty fascinating. You see in 1862 in the original journals, there are indigenous trail networks as marked by the yellow arrows that come into Wild Rice Lake. If we look at the 1862 original survey map right here, you can see in the yellow arrows, it comes off of Ike Walton Lake. And then They would paddle across here and then take a overland trip all the way to Island Lake. These were probably ice roads and toboggan roads primarily, but they could be used as overland trails with canoes and alike. Over on the right on a Google map, I'll have that all outlined for you. So that's pretty cool. But we have something else that's interesting, a mystery. As we look at the cartography of the whole area, we have this halfway lake mystery. All of a sudden, Rice Lake is renamed in 1890 and early 1900 maps as Halfway Lake. As you look at the left here, as you look in the upper on the right, and right here at the lower right, what is this Halfway Lake all about? A halfway to what? So why don't we explore some of the possibilities on this name? And as you go traveling on your pontoon boat this year and enjoy a cocktail, you can think about these different options. Where would it be halfway between? This is the more modern map that calls Halfway Lake. Perhaps it's halfway between the Rest Lake Dam, here's Halfway Lake, and Trout Lake, where there were many resorts and alike. These would be the two major connecting hubs. Maybe that was the reference. Or perhaps it goes way back to 1846. The gentleman who said that streams were barely sufficient for the width of a canoe, he spent the night with White Thunder, a Lac de Flambeau chief, on Cross Lake, probably Rest Lake, and would go to Trout Lake. In the green arrow, it might be halfway there. But we have more maps to consider. So this 1847 map, here is Monoman Lake. This is Wild Rice Lake with the arrow. Perhaps it's the Six Paws Portage, its main route from Lake Superior through what is now Mercer, the Turtle Portage Band, all the way out to the main portages to Lac Vieux de Serre, the Wisconsin River. All of the travelers who traveled from the Great Lakes over to Lac Vieux de Serre, the river, all used this route or went through Flambeau, but they all went through Trout Lake. So this could be a halfway point there. Or maybe we're looking at this all wrong. If we look at this map from 1878, maybe Wild Rice or Halfway Lake here is halfway between those Ojibwe trails here and up to the big ricing camps on Big Lake. On the left, you see pictures of ricing on Big Lake on the inlet of Rice Creek into that area. But at some point, and it is a mystery, Halfway Lake was named for something along those lines. As we look at Wild Rice Lake and logging and so on, through Lac de Flambeau, you can see that there is a rail line that goes right across this Ike Walton swamp. You see it from 1937. You see it from 2018. And here it again, it is in 2020. It's interesting that it was logged. You can see the logging effect here in 37. In 2018, it was really, really quite grown over. And the Ojibwe logged it just in 2020. And it's interesting that they left the old growth from the period before to continue, and they logged it. So when you go across by here, you have to understand that they had a railroad and they did logging throughout that area. Here's an aerial view of Wild Rice Lake. And on Rice Lake, there were two resorts owned by the Bakkens here, by what would become Woody's, and here that will turn into Cops ultimately. Also, there were farms. There was one right here off of Nelson Lake and one here right off of Wild Rice Lake. And so we're going to explore this farm ownership and the development along Rice Lake. This would be for all of you Bakken Road today. And this is the Bakken farm. Speaking of the Bakkens, Conrad Bakken bought 100 acres of land, and his wife Anna was a well-known baker and pastry chef, and they worked very diligently as Norwegian immigrants to the United States. Conrad Bakken was a master carpenter, but he did so much more. He was also a farmer, a guide. He operated not one, but two resorts. And you can see Big Rice Lake for rent, just a 5-minute drive. And there is Conrad and Anna Bakken right there. A nice catch of fish on Wild Rice Lake. The Bakkens were guides. Take a look at all those walleyes, but look at that beach. It kind of shows you how that water vacillates with those early slides when they raised and lowered the dam. And the fishing was good on Rice Lake at that time, and so were the beaches. Bill Waffle came as a very young child with his father, who worked for the railroads, and they stayed immediately in 1917 in Bakken's Resort. Here's Mary Jane Rose right here. This is one of the great romance stories of summer residents in the area. Turns out that they hung together as young children. And then after the war, Bill Waffle went to meet Mary Jane again, and they fell in love. And the Waffle family still owns property on Wild Rice Lake. But Grover Waffle was the gentleman who came up here in the 1890s. We find that in historic researching the area, the railroaders knew about the pristine wilderness areas here, like Joe Ilge, like Grover Waffle, and they came up and participated. And here's Bill Waffle as a little boy. The Bakkens ultimately sold to the Copps due to a family medical need in the 1930s and lost one of their 2 resorts. And Copps cabins operated there for a very long time, as I showed you earlier. Below, the Manitowish Waters Historical Society really needs images from Woody's resorts. We don't have those in our chamber guides and alike. And it would be really good if some of you in the group who have some of those images or any kind of ads, we'd love for you to give them to us at the Kohler Library. Just down the shore toward Nelson Lake, after Woody's Resort, was Jensen's Norway Resort, operated for several years right in this lovely isthmus between Nelson Lake and Wild Rice Lake. I think people on Wild Rice Lake try to keep it a secret, how beautiful this area is, how nice the beaches are on this side of Wild Rice Lake, and the reputation of being a weedy lake. You know, there are some weeds there, but it is really quite a stunning lake with great shoreline, and with Nelson Lake next to it. And Jensen's Resort was right there. Now, here we have 3 generations of the Waffles standing at what we call the bridge today, but it used to be the tube. For those of you who remember, before the new bridge was put in, there was a culvert there, orchestrated largely by cranberry growers and alike. We have Grover right here, Will, and Sean Waffle, who still stays on the Waffle property today. And right here, they have the bald eagle's nest that they claim was there from 1946, continuously occupied. Now, the Betzer family have been very good with sharing their family's history and alike, and this is a convergence of 2 data points that I think are kind of interesting. This is all wild rice in the early 1950s growing in front of their property in the middle of the channel between Wild Rice Lake and Alder Lake. Here's one of my favorite people, Bobby McClellan. He wrote a newsletter for walleye fishermen and fishermen, and I took this clip out of that for this. He's had a remember when, he says, when the Trout River between Wild Rice and Alder Lake was but a snake trail through the wild rice. And there's that snake trail from the deserts. It was just as Bobby described it. So people wondered, you know, where did this wild rice come from? Well, it's come back. It's not a new development, and there's a reason why Wild Rice Lake has its name. So here's an original map of Alder Lake. So as we start to scoot up from that wild rice patch there and enter into the lake, we're going to go around in this direction and hook back right here. This is what the original surveyors drew the map in 1862 as. So as you move up through the lake area on my property on Alder Lake, my family purchased this from the Hill family. And they had created a cottage industry of Hills Archery. Here is a catalog from 1955. It ran into the 1960s. They had a special broadhead that hunters love, but they also had blunts and other things. It was called a Hills Hornet. You see it right here. It was a triangular broadhead. This catalog, the dies, and these broadheads have been donated by me and my family to the Manitowish Waters Historical Society. So these are being sold all over the United States, and this is a page ripped out from that catalog. So Hills Hornets was right here, number 12 on Alder Lake, to give you an idea where I live. And this was a modern cottage that they rented out, and the Hill family provided lodge and guiding services, and probably all the Hills Hornets you could shoot. Archery has a strong tradition here on Alder Lake. The Reamer family, there's a residence, and certainly True Flight arrows, and the development of the Bear Bar and Art Loha and the Case family on Big Lake. This is just an extension of all of those archery traditions. So as we move up a little bit further, we come into the Lavigne Homestead, okay? And you can see right here, the farm area is kind of a subsistence farm that Lavigne's ran at that time. And it was part of Joe Lavigne, who hailed from Canada, lived in Hurley for a while, but was in Manitowish Waters by about 1890. In 1897, he was running tent camps up on Rest Lake and running his business. For those of you who are interested, we are doing podcasts at the Manitowish Waters Historical Society. We have an 1899 two-part story from Forest and Stream magazine with Joe Lavigne and Peter Vance leading a great deer hunt, bear hunt, and wildcat hunt. And it is really quite a hoot. All you do is click on this, it'll play right through your device, and you can listen to it. And when you do, you'll hear a lot about Joe Lavigne. He was kind of a prankster, he and Peter Vance, but he was a premier camp cook. So I'm not going to read a lot of it, but this is just amazing. Think about this. They're leaving from Rest Lake Dam, and here's Joe Lavigne putting together the breakfast. At 3 o'clock the next morning, they were up and eating breakfast, fried pike, potatoes, eggs, bacon, and coffee. Lunch for 4 was put into a basket, fishing tackle, gun, both rifle and shot. They were in their boats by 3:30 and were on their way to the Clear Lake Trail to portage into Big Lake. Those are the kinds of things that were going on. And as a young man, you see Joe Lavigne here. He was known for his rowing prowess. Here's an older gentleman. I can appreciate that. He's looking at the lake from the pier. But Lavigne here on Alder Lake had a boat livery. Cal Laporte suggested that Lavigne was one of the caretakers, as George Laporte was for the Southgate estate on Little Trout Lake, and people actually stayed along Sunny Cove, a resort, and the Lavigne property to get access to Little Trout Lake and the canals. Lavigne was a great blacksmith, logger, carpenter, guide, farmer, and caretaker, and he ran the Oaks Resort right on the shores of Alder Lake. Now, as you move up a little bit, just a hair, longtime resident of the Lavigne property, a longtime resort rather, is Sunny Cove. And it's beautiful cottages, and its name is really quite appropriate. Really look out over Alder Lake, and is part of a real serious string of resorts that run from Lavigne's all the way up to the channel. And a lot of it was on Loveless's property. Speaking of Loveless, you can see from this 1913 plat map, Robert Loveless bought all of these areas here. This part of Southgate's estate was acquired by Lavigne. And so these early pioneers were kind of all about the eastern side of Alder Lake. And you can see that all of this was not logged either, that it was all held together in its largely virgin forest structure. So as we go up through here, we're going to talk about Lavigne, but also all the other resorts that were part of this area. One of the first resorts was Rossow's resort. We believe that's just upstream a little bit from Sunny Cove. And you can take a look at these white cabins in the shoreline. Pay close attention to that. This is another area that we could use some feedback from our listening audience, and any more pictures or stories would help. We also had the Allendale cottages. Notice how these white cabins and this shoreline resembles what we saw before in Rossow's. And this was noted as number 17. So it's right here near Sunny Cove. And that's something that we would really like to get more information on. But it's a part of a great resort tradition on the eastern shoreline. Just up from that area is Alder Lake Rentals, one of two active resorts that are still on Rest Lake that I'm aware of, this and Alderwood. And that's run by Tom and Michelle Barrett. Now, Loveless, as I said before, by those aerial photos, protected his timber, and he left these huge pines behind. He was so enthralled with this, he called it his Virgin Forest Park, and really built an astounding resort complex and entertainment complex, and also a business complex. And it's kind of hard to show you all. So this is where his pavilion is going to be with the green arrow. But up here is where his sawmill is going to be, and some of his resort areas too on the lake. Again, Robert Loveless was an ambitious man. So as we look at the pavilion and the dance hall, this has a storied past. Built and finished about 1924. Carl Christensen, the gentleman who was shot by Babyface Nelson and survived, commented, always Saturday nights he'd be holding a big dance party. He would tightrope across the hall to entertain all the people. And this is when he was an older gentleman. That was the moonshine days, you see. So they were selling moon. And I think that was the object of having all those different dances. Well, indeed, the Lovelaces, as many pioneers, dabbled in moonshine, but you have to see the grandeur of the forest park. Look at all of these booths for people to be in, all the bar area back here. Again, this is all during Prohibition. It kicks off in 1924, and look at these beams. Think about Loveless, Robert Loveless, walking on a tightrope during intermission over that area. It had to be quite an event. And then as you look at the back, he had this giant player piano that would operate during other times. So music and fun and gaiety was all part of the event. And they were still going strong by 1928. Look at this. Midnight luncheon, Saturday night, August 25th, from 12 a.m. to 1 a.m., you, for 50 cents, would get a sandwich, and could dance and enjoy those times. People weren't driving home from there, I can tell you. In 1924, from the Ironwood Daily Globe, you can see that they had both black and white bands, an all-college jazz band. They were doing jitney dances where you basically had coupons to get dances. It was quite an event. There was also some trouble there. Lloyd Laporte reported in some notes that we received from Michael Dunn that as deputy sheriff staying at Burchard, he said there's a lot of trouble at Virgin Forest Park. He said in the dance hall after a fight, they were kicking down doors and drawing guns and the like. It seems that most of the proprietors up here had inside informants to know when the revenuers were come to catching them. And the story is whenever there was an investigation of the activities at a place like Virgin Forest Park, they were told and everybody dropped their drinks and started to drink tea and the like. If that wasn't enough activity, a sawmill was then developed at Mill Point. Notice this point, we'll get back to this. This is where logs were skidded in from the roads and where they were brought in from Alder Lake. And you can see today on Mill Point, there's an actual cut as you enter the channel by the buoy that would head east, where they used to have a road bringing in those. But here's the saw blade, here's Robert Loveless, and here's the wood they're stacking up all on the mill point on the far end of Alder Lake by the outlet of the Trout River. Later, they'll put a nice building around this and have a track to pull logs out of the mill pond, sometimes called a hot pond, but they basically used Alder Lake as the way to move their logs. I was told that in one year, Loveless made his own dam across there and raised the water level to make it easier for him to operate his mill. But this is the fruit of what he did. Look at the lumber he stacked. Look at the rails he has for hand cars that he uses to move his lumber around. Again, very ambitious, very impressive phase 3 logging and lumbering going up on Alder Lake. And here's the mill point today on Alder Lake for the resorts. And here's the scrap heap over here for all the leftover trimmings from his logging, his lumbering rather, and making boards. But that's not enough as well. He was working with Ole Fisher, who was a rum runner. Right there they are with some fish that they caught together. Here's his rum running car. And Ole Fisher was a known bootlegger. Another person who came up there was the Milwaukee Sheriff Westfall. And here he is with his secretary doing some kind of support for Sheriff Westfall in the Northwoods. And it was shared by Dolly Turpey that Ole Fisher's trade was sometimes facilitated by Westfall. Again, this idea of what happens in Manitowish Waters stays in Manitowish Waters, and it was an area where a lot of activities would go unmonitored and unenforced. But Loveless then migrated his businesses from Alder Lake right here. Here's the pavilion going over the water out to first Highway 10, which is Twin Pine Road with tent camps and cabins, and then ultimately out to Highway 51. Here we see the shoreline of Virgin Forest Park again. During a lot of those parties, people were able to rent boats. So if you came out here from Ironwood or Chicago and you wanted to go for a romantic row with your date, you could do that out on Alder Lake. But fishing was always key, and Loveless was a well-renowned guide. Here's Loveless on his Highway 10 business and bar that was later moved to where the Howling Dog today is here. Here's his zoo back in this area. And again, the activity that came out of the Lovelesses off of Alder Lake was impressive. As the Lovelesses began to sell off their property, right in the middle of that property between the pavilion and the sawmill was Betzer's Resort. Here's an ad for it. It was a very popular resort in the 40s and the 50s, and they had beautiful cabins and accommodations. The tall pines, the great beaches made it an absolute destination, and showing off those big catches who bring sportsmen here. But families spent a lot of time swimming on these shores. And we don't have one, we don't have two, we have 3 in a row, Mill Point resorts, all at that area where there used to be that boathouse and that big stump, and the hot pond was right back here. We see Lenders, Johnson's, and Bears Mill Point resorts, all operated on what was formerly Loveless's property. So if we just go up the Trout River a little bit, we get to the Twin Pine Bar, which is a very popular establishment for my contemporaries between their upper 50s to about 70. It was first, though, Art Otto's Twin Pine Bar, as you see right here, looking over the Trout River. But Helen and John Theisen took this over and added many cottages away from the water as well as those on the water, and ran a fantastic bar. And there's some Butch ultimately will be running that. And Butch was also a seller of guns. So oftentimes you go for a drink and you could practice with some of the new armaments he would have hanging behind his bar. And I'll let you know that I enjoyed that and purchased a few guns from him. So moving back onto Alder Lake here where the yellow arrow is, here's the Kempinski boathouse. It is a great story, the Kempinski Kendall story and how they built this boathouse. This was part of the Loveless property, and it is a unique architectural structure and a great family story. Here we're looking across at the Dobbinspec property right over here. And it was developed, and we did a great interview with the Kendall Kempinski family, and it's on our YouTube channel. I invite you all to go out there and listen to it. One of the stories that I remember that was most favorable is that the patriarch would say, why don't you bring some of those flatfish back? I don't want all those round ones. In other words, not the northerns, not the muskie. Give me some panfish. I want some fish to eat. So it's an interesting thing. And speaking of fish, I had to interject this at some point, and I thought this was the best one. In 1890, back in that podcast that I told you about, that has Peter Vance and Joe Lavigne, this is an excerpt from that, from Forest and Stream in 1900. And he says, the largest muskie I ever saw, a 48-pounder. And when he was opened, a full-grown mallard duck was found. True as gospel, happened in Alder Lake. It's interesting that there's a lot of big muskie stories, and I think some of the experienced muskie fishermen will reinforce that a lot of muskie tournaments here have been won with fish off of Alder Lake. So it kind of has that nice tradition. And that started early on. So on Alder Lake, here we go. We had a railroad. I bet you most of you didn't know that. It came right off the Powell Marsh spur, came right across the marsh. This is the Riala Cranberry Company's property. Don Riala has told me about all the spikes and plates and brake wheels and things that he's found here from this logging area. Goes across like that, this dips down and goes right down the Alder Park roadway. And then there was a hoist or a lift there. And I followed this right to the private property line right here. And it absolutely was a railroad. And I think it wasn't narrow gauge. I think it was full size, and they would hoist right out of Alder Lake. So the next time you're on the beach, just think about the railroad hoist in that area. This is an interesting discovery that was first told to us by Dolly Turpey on one of our YouTube videos that we have online for you to watch about an Ojibwe camp that was right across from the Loveless property. And the Ojibwe would spend the summers and do a bit of trading with the local residents, in the area of, 1905 to into the 1920s. And then there was a canal here. This canal that we'll talk about later will create easy access. Not that the Ojibwe can't get across the other swamps and so on, but this will just expedite that. And when you think about it, here's that camp right here. And we found other documents and journals to support the existence of this Ojibwe summer residence. But they could then sell to Deer Park, to Bucks, to LaFay's, out here to Peter Vance's area. So berries were sold there at the Alder Lake camp. They were blueberries, as you see here, and wild cranberries and alike. We recently discovered this. We don't believe it was at this particular camp, but it showed Ojibwe posing for postcards. But again, having camps where they would sell some of their traditional cultural materials that were really quite prized. We know this to be true because not only birch bark items like this were prized, moose call, small canoes. We know that Sarah Vance had all that she could do to keep up with the demand of making moccasins as an Ojibwe woman married to Peter Vance. So for the summer residents and the full-time residents and the visitors, this was bustling business. Birch bark baskets and the like, all were going on within that area. The Kemet family will then develop that property which the Indian camp was on, and they called it its Chano Lakes Resort. And it was a beautiful resort with a large lodge right on the western shore of Alder Lake. This will later be sold to the Scotton family, and the Scotton, also the Cagney, is related to the Cagney family on Island Lake. They started to develop this as Alderwood and named it as such. Here's the exchange that took place between the two families. And it was just a beautiful, beautiful property here. I see some limbs are down here, kind of like what we've enjoyed the Manitowish Waters since that big icy storm not too long ago. Floyd Christensen later bought the Alderwood property, built up some more cabins like Bayview. Betty and Bob Christensen were all part of this. And Kay Kranz is the daughter of Betty and Bob. And Roger and Kay spent many years out on Alderwood Point, and it was absolutely fantastic. Today, Alderwood is owned by the Bartling family, and Becca Bartling manages it and has it, as you can see, in just immaculate shape, really kind of great historic testimony to the great resort era, and which is slipping away from the chain from the way it used to be. So here's something you may not know, that just down the lake, we also had a girls' camp. That's right, Camp Ontonagon for girls right here. And right this area was the tennis court. You can see in 1940, Gladys Penny came there to be a tennis instructor. I was told about this because all the kids older than me in their 70s and 80s would come here to ride their bicycle because it was the only pavement in the area. Sadly, this girls' camp was ravaged by flames. This is an excerpt from a 1936 Ironwood Daily Globe. 2 suffer burns. Main lodge is destroyed in the flames. Mrs. Varney and her son were painfully burned, but it did not end the tradition. The Varneys really were dedicated to have a girls' camp on Alder Lake to allow women to enjoy the outdoors and develop woodcraft skills. It wasn't just for boys, women were involved too, so they were really quite innovative in that regard. There's still one lone cabin there from Camp Ontonagon. This is the infirmary that's up on top of the hill. So here's Little Trout Lake. And, you know, that's not on the list. You wonder, what am I doing? But right here off of Little Trout Lake, there is a canal right here. And we're going to talk about that canal system because there's something very interesting. And from a Kerner's Lodge, they actually advertised the canal from Alder Lake to Little Trout Lake because it was a popular space. It was also part of a large network with a railroad magnate by the name of Hewitt and a hotel magnate by the name of Southgate created these canals so they would have a private and exclusive fishing paradise. But this little trail also went from Big Trout Lake all the way to Alder Lake. And this is Sunny Cove, where some of those people stayed that I talked about before. So right here on Sunny Cove, this would be where folks could go and spend the night if they were going up and imbibing, let's say at Buck's Resort or a Deer Park, and didn't want to go up the canal. So here's the main house in the canal. This is a diorama that was created by Stephen Bartling under the supervision of his grandfather, Cal Laporte, who was actually on the property in his youth. The caretaker's house alike, the canal, and the lock right on Little Trout Lake. This is what the locks would look like, these large wooden locks and these long ditches, canals that were dug out. As you look at it here on Alder Lake, this is Loveless's property here with the virgin pines on the background. Here's the boathouse. Here are women dressed in more or less flapper kind of 1920s garb, and right by the lock and the lock mechanism here at the beginning of Alder Lake. So anytime you go over Alder Lake Road and you look over toward the lake as you go by Manitowish Waters Cranberry, you're going over right here, this part of the ditch. And this plank work was right here for folks to walk and actually fish, because the fish did move through the canals as well, and people canoed in them. Some say that this is on Alder Lake. Dolly Turpey does, and I leave it as such. But as I look at it, this looks like the eastern shore of Little Trout Lake. This is the high ground, I think, over by Ike Walton. But either way, I don't care. This thing came on a railroad and went through the canals and got to Little Trout, Alder, who knows how many lakes. It is an impressive runabout for the day. And it just shows the length that people went to have their fun on the water, as we will soon this summer. Also, wilderness tripping was very popular during this time, and there was a great deal of woodcraft, which means being environmentally aware and going out and know how to handle yourself in the woods. Camp Michiki, which was in Winchester, advertised the route from the camp all the way to the Indian reservation, and actually showed the canal as part of what they would do in their wilderness tripping program. Camp Manitowish also would use the canals. Leaving Boulder Lake here, we have a full journal where they talk about how in 1921 they came to the end of Alder Lake and they found that old boathouse that I showed you in an old canal. They said the cranberries along the banks were abundantly fruiting and native dewberries, and they ate frog legs for supper. It was absolutely quite an event that they had moving through Alder Lake and this canal, quite a time. So here's the boathouse, here's the canal, and they were picking frogs and berries the whole way, all the way up off of Alder Lake. Fantastic story. Later on, they'll go to Sunfish Lake just north of White Sands Lake in Lac de Flambeau, and they'll run into Ojibwe Indians and women and children who were making baskets for the Indian fair, very much like the Ojibwe camp on Alder Lake. They would actually chew choke cherries and run strips of moist bathwood through their mouths to color the strips of the baskets and the like. If you want to read this full podcast of Camp Manitowish and the trip, you can go right to our webpage, click on podcast, and then click on Woodcraft, and it'll play right away. It's real short. I think you'll find it to be really interesting and fun. And here's some of those basswood basket examples here where the colors are put in and how they were stitched together, very much like the story from the journal from Camp Manitowish. Well, we're almost done with our trip here. And at Lamb's and Ludwig's Resort, which is up on the higher bank as you near the inlet to Alder Lake on the west side, they operated for many years. And that property was just recently sold and moved out of being a resort. Moving down around to number 4 here on Alder Lake, here would have been Lamb's right here. Number 4 right here, this is where Loker's Resort and Bloom's Cottages along the Trout River outlet to Alder Lake was used quite often. And I live right across the river from this, and I can tell you they've been popular for decades. And then finally today, Tom and Carol Butler have continued those traditions. I'm not sure if they're operating the resort to a great degree right now, but I can tell you that Tom's expert gunsmithing services is a well appreciated service that many of us have enjoyed here for decades as well. Well, we're coming to a close of our trip, and I hope you enjoyed your ride around Wild Rice and Alder Lakes. We came across a few mysteries that we have some gaps in, so maybe you can help us out with that. We found this from 1963, the Camden candle blinders on Alder Lake. We're not sure what that was located. And as I said before, Woody's Resort was a huge part of Wild Rice Lake's history, and we just don't have a lot of specific information or images on that. So thanks so much for everything, and I would like to open up questions, and you can unmute yourself and just raise them, and we can share these things out. Any questions in the chat? No questions in the chat, I've been informed. Any questions from the group? Well, hearing none.
I have a question. This is Richard Dodge. Are the canals you described still navigable by canoe?
Not really. The last I've heard of any decent navigation was back in the 70s. And it was very challenging then. They have filled in. I have heard tales of calamity also in the last 30 years of people who have tried to move through the canals. The problem with the canals are that they're on private property, and they are also on tribal lands for the most part. And so access and so on is difficult. But if you wanted to go into the Wayback Machine and use one of those canals, there is one that is beautifully opened, and it's all the way on the other side of Alder Lake, right off of the train station, off of White Sand Lakes. And the White Sand Lake stop for lack of flambeau, but it doesn't start in White Sand Lake. It starts in a lake called Head Flyer Lake. So you could take your kayak and maybe talk to some of the folks at Dillman's, or you could put in at the boat landing on the other side and paddle into the bay by Dillman's, and you can go right up that canal, and that one is navigable. All the rest, I think, are pretty much inaccessible and not well advised to use. Great question.